Welcome back, everyone. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Marcus Bell for our second lecture today. Marcus is a doctoral candidate working on a project entitled Choreographing Tragedy at Oxford University. They are co-convener of Queer and the Classical Network, which organized a seminar series, Fall 2020, and conference Queer and Classical, Critical Futures, Critical Feelings. Marcus is also an associate lecturer in theatre and performance at Goldsmiths University. They perform with By Jove Theatre Company as an artistic associate and as a dance artist with Thomas Page Dancers, a company based between London and Oxford. And today, Marcus is going to talk to us about Dimitris Papaioannou. I've pronounced that incorrectly. Papaioannou, yeah. So I'll hand over to you. Marcus, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue, for that warm welcome. Thank you to everyone who's here today and to everyone who's been contributing to the thinking that we've been doing over the past 2 days, both the papers that have been given, but also the practical workshops that have been happening that have really helped me think through a lot of my ideas about how notation could function, and also how important embodied knowledge is and practice as research is to dance studies. So we've been doing a lot of thinking over the past 2 days, and I thought I might start today just by doing a little response just to some of that thinking that I hope would kind of frame the talk today as a kind of methodology for the kind of work that I want to do with Papaioannou'S dances. So I thought I'd start by introducing a film called Isidora's Children. This is a film by Damien Manuel. And the film is a response to a work created by Isadora Duncan after the death of her 2 children called Mother. The film has 3 separate parts, and each part has a separate group of dancers working in response to the notation and also the autobiography of Isadora Duncan. So it starts off with Agathe Bonitzer, who's rehearsing in the studio using the physical notation and the autobiography. And we see Agathe rendering the movement in space, stopping and starting, returning to the text, reading the notation and Isidora's words about her process of grief after the loss of her children. The second phrase features Marika Rizzi teaching her protégée Manon Carpentier to perform Mother ahead of a public recital. We see them in the studio together discussing kind of the affective rendering of the performance. So what does it mean to dance in this and from this place of grief? We see them in discussion as well as in the rehearsal room, going through those kind of familiar kind of nerves, hesitations, and mistakes that happen when you're orientated towards a public performance. And then finally, in the third phrase, we don't see Manon perform, but instead we see Elsa Wollaston watching. So we witness her witnessing Manon's performance, and we watch her emotional response as the tears kind of roll down her face. We watch her leave the theatre, have dinner on the way home at her local restaurant, and then when she returns home, we watch her turn to a photograph of her deceased son. And then almost as if out of nowhere, we see her perform the full phrase of Mother. So this is the first time we've seen the full phrase in the film. And I think this emotional and emotive performance sets up something really important that I want to discuss, which is the sharing back and forth response that happens around and from a piece of notation. So the film is really about a collective processing of choreography, but also a collective processing of grief. So as well as starting to think with this idea of kind of a collective use of notation as something that records an experience from the past, but also projects into a future potential performance, I thought I'd kind of list out a few potential definitions that have arisen over the past 2 days about what is notation. So I've got that notation is a visual or written representation of an embodied and or sonic expression. It's an aide-memoire, a shorthand description of something in the past, and a prompt or guide for its future reappearance. It is a partial structure, an object or system that participates in a call and response with present, past, and future acts of performance, a description of or guide to a kind of relationality, which can be open to interpretation, which can be read in terms of time, affect, ethics, space, rhythm, force, velsim. Notation is an anchor, a threshold, a sinew. And I didn't mean for these to be exhaustive, so I'm sure we all have our own kind of lists circulating of what notation has been and has been useful for. But I wanted to kind of just bring them in with this film in mind, just to kind of frame the rest of the paper. Why I do this is because I think Papaioannou also has a similar open use and thinking with notation. He talks about the uses of material and their possibilities for creating choreography. And here are kind of two quotes that I pulled from an interview where he talks about how material objects, memories, and ideas contribute to the way that he produces his dances. So the first is he says, I grew up with this neurosis about Greek culture and its legacy. I create things using archetypes, not words. And when you're dealing with archetypes, you end up at Greek culture whether you like it or not. In any case, the myths are still relevant today. Through archetypes, we can analyze today's world, think of the way they've been used in psychoanalysis. And the second, in theater, anything can become material to use, from your subconscious to a disco ball. The only good thing about postmodernism is that we can put anything together that we need, and what comes out the other side is composition. So what can we take from this? As I've said, he's always thinking about and working with image, object, and memories as anchors and thresholds. Personally, I do disagree with him that not everything always has to come back to Greek culture, but I think he's revealing the way that he thinks about process in the rehearsal room, that this is always the kind of absence or return or frame that he's using to guide choreography with the dancers in space. And the other thing is something that we've been witnessing in the workshops, that there's some relationship between notation or material that is used to produce choreography and then composition. And there's a kind of free-flowing or, again, back and forth or emergent relationship between these two things that isn't, one thing leading directly to the other. What comes out on the other side is composition, some kind of forward-thinking relationship there. So, having established this way of thinking with and about notation and material, my presentation is going to have kind of three sections. The first, I'm going to do a little bit of contextualizing about Papaioannou and his work. Then I'm going to think about particular responses to some materials in the production of two versions of MEDEA, one in 1993 and the other in 2008. And then I'm going to think about and try and bring together, again in a non-exhaustive way, but hopefully in a suggestive way, some of the threads that we've been thinking with between gesture and notation. So what if we considered gesture itself to also be a kind of notation, a way of carrying forward and producing further performance? So, context. Dimitris Papaioannou is an enigmatic figure. He's a working class artist who started creating work in a queer underground countercultural theatre company called AFFORDANCE Dance Theatre, AFFORDANCE meaning ground, which operated out of a squat in Athens. But he also holds a Golden Cross of the Holy Order for his contribution to national Greek culture. He's a student of the iconic queer Greek painter Yannis Saroukis, from which he gained his focus on the poetics of the mundane, and attended the Athens School of Fine Arts before founding the AFFORDANCE Dance Theatre Company in 1986. Over its 13-year run, the company gained a loyal audience for its experimental practice, performance lab structure, and for shaping Greek dance theatre sensibility. He was mentored by the famous postmodern director Robert Wilson, and he takes forward those kind of postmodern ideas as we saw from the framing quote. His choreographies are highly aestheticized, featuring lots of nudity, queer visual art reference, soft lighting, camp, and many of the Tanz theatre or dance theatre elements developed and popularized by Pina Bausch. More so than Bausch, though, Papaioannou is open about his use of material and talks a lot and expresses the work in ways that Pina often refused to do, allowing to leave its ambiguities more kind of present. He's probably best known for being the artistic director and choreographer of the Athens Olympic opening ceremony in 2004, and for being the first choreographer, alongside Alain Lucien Oyen, to make a full-length work for the Tanztheater Wuppertal Pina Bausch following her death. Throughout his career, he's moved from these underground queer DIY spaces to international stages, and Medea is a really important production as he describes it as being the hinge which allowed him to operate that move. It's the work that gets funded by the National Theatre of Greece, allows the company to go on an international tour, and allows him also to meet Pina Bausch multiple times. So here's a kind of timeline of his work. Again, a rough estimation, doesn't include everything, but you'll see where Medea and Medea 2 are positioned in relationship to his other works. Interesting to note, he's made 2 pieces during the pandemic, Ink, a duet, and Transverse Orientation, which is due to come out shortly, I believe next year. So that's it for Papaioannou for now. But what about Medea, the material that he's working with? So I've taken 2 excerpts from the kind of brilliant and freely available ebook on Medea, produced by the APGRD. And there's 2 kind of core things that I want to keep in mind from this myth. One is the plot, which I'll go through briefly, but the other is this idea of myth itself being a kind of potential for notation. And if we think of myth in this way, we have to acknowledge that it itself is always shifting. Like they say here, no 2 versions of Medea's story are quite the same, and there are many versions already in circulation before the 2 plays, the ancient 2 Medea plays that have survived, came into being, into performance. So there's 2 of them that survive from the ancient world, one from Greece and one from Rome. They were written 500 years apart in different countries and different cultures, one in ancient Greek by Euripides, and the other in Latin by Seneca, one in a democracy, the other under the emperor. So the plot of Euripides' Medea is as follows. And I picked Euripides' Medea specifically because it includes the dramaturgical act of infanticide, which Medea inflicts on her children as a way of getting revenge on her husband Jason. And this is a core component of Papaioannou's work. So Medea is exiled from her homeland of Colchis after violently betraying her father, King Aeetes, and her people. Medea lives in Corinth with her husband Jason and their 2 sons. Jason is now about to marry another woman, Glauce, the daughter of Creon, the Corinthian king. A distraught Medea rages at Jason for this betrayal and cannot be consolidated by either the chorus of Corinthian women or her Colchian nurse. Creon, suspicious of Medea's reputation for magic and murder, fears her revenge and demands her exile from Corinth. Jason assures Medea that she and their children will not be destitute in their exile, but Medea accuses her husband of trying to placate her with empty words. To her relief, Medea meets Aegeus, the heirless king of Athens, requests safe passage to Athens, in return for which she promises to cure his infertility. With her future secured, Medea plots to kill Creon and Glauce and to destroy Jason by killing their children. Pretending to forgive Jason, Medea offers a wedding gift to his new bride, a crowned and golden robe, gifts passed down from Medea's grandfather, Helios, god of the sun. But the gifts are poisoned, and a messenger reports that Glauce has died in agony as she puts on Medea's garments. Creon, embracing his daughter, meets the same fate. Medea exacts further revenge on Jason by murdering their children as Jason confronts Medea, mourning the death of his bride and children. She appears with the bodies of her sons in the sky in Helios' chariot, pulled by serpents. So this is the kind of dramaturgical structure in which Papaioannou finds himself responding with his 2 versions of Medea. Interesting also, as we saw yesterday in the brilliant paper on Shakespearean receptions, Papaioannou's work features no words, no text. So it's holding this myth in mind without any of the kind of thick poetic language that is normally associated with Greek tragedy and its receptions. So how do these 2 things come together? Papaioannou tells us in reflection on Medea that he looks at the production as evoking the sort of feeling you get when you gaze at a statue. A sort of melancholic feeling comes over you, a connection you get to a manifestation of a human being who once was. The thought of a human being standing there in time. He thinks that his Medea has this emotional impact. So I reflected on this last night, specifically after Jennifer's talk yesterday on the artist, the index, and the object, as how a kind of sculpture or an artwork can leave the impressions of an artist who made it, but yet leave the kind of absence of that artist. So we might see the marks that Pollock's made on the canvas, but we cannot access that presence of the artist. And Jennifer used the Derridian trace to think about the always deferent kind of presence of that artist, not ever originating in one place, but always being pushed back or signified continuously. And I think Papaioannou was talking about a similar sort of melancholy or yearning, looking back at a statue, which we see present in space that represents a body, movement, and also has the indexical marks of the sculptor who made it, but we cannot access their presence. So Papaioannou talks about Medea functioning in this same way. And we see that it's not just the myth itself that's influenced the production, but it's actually a multiply mediated use of images, ideas, and objects. For the character of Medea, we see reference the Sphinx on the bottom, next to the photo. That's a kind of archaic Minoan snake goddess statue. We see a kind of reptilian beings, as well as a swan and a peacock. And these don't only shape the costume, but also are informing the way that the performers move through space. Likewise, Jason, we'll see, has been influenced by Donald Duck, but also by the queer paintings of Yanis Sarouchis. So you'll see those kind of the fully dressed sailor in white next to the nude men. That's a Sarouchis. And also these kind of influences of kind of colonial sailor garb and outfits. So Papaioannou is not only combining, and the dancers and designers are not only combining the myth of material from Medea, but also all of these other mediating ideas, images, to form a kind of network of associations and choreographic possibilities. So the two versions of Medea operate across a period of time, and I conjecture that they form two separate kinds of response to the same forms of notation. So keeping those ideas in mind of how they've been shaped out of this kind of postmodern sensibility, combining material in a way to make composition, my argument is that these two separate kinds of response operated forms of different pose in relation to the past and offer up different thinkings for how we might look forward to future productions of Medea. So first, I will show you a little clip of the 1993 Medea. And I should note that these are trailers, so they don't represent a kind of chronological take of what's happening on stage, but they'll give some sense of the feeling of movement and the usage of costuming and sculpture. So that was the first version. And Papaioannou describes the way that this relates to the past using the term and images. Ooh, let me just swap back. There we go. No? Sorry, technical difficulties. Let me just make this full screen. There we go. There's the mouse. So Papaioannou describes this using the language and terminology of camp. So he describes this response to the past and the myth as having this camp quality, and he uses the word camp here to say it's a very useful term because it allows you to say something when you can't say it directly, because it's worn out and forces you to find another way of phrasing it. For Papaioannou, this is where he thinks camp is useful, at least for his work. It is an environment, in an environment that ridicules and yet at the same time recreates it on the other side of ridicule. So what I wanted to point out here is this kind of forward-orientated use of camp as a way of looking askance or queerly at something, to take all those kind of excessive gestures, those scenes reminiscent of a Hollywood movie or a Maria Callas opera of Medea, and to put them in a new way to find something on the other side of them. So that's the earlier version of Medea, but turning to now the later version in 2008, we see a very different kind of response to the same subject material. So in this response, Papaioannou says that he openly wanted to create a different feeling to the work. He acknowledges that between the two periods, the Olympics happened, and this brought him to a lot of people's attention. So he returned to Medea, attracted by the idea of presenting it again with an all-new cast and approaching it with a new idea, to take the passion out. He says, I wanted to reconstruct it, refine it, clear it out, strip it of anything unnecessary, drain the blood from the performance, and deliver it in the cleanest form I could manage. That was my intention. So what I want to suggest is that Papaioannou's choreography of the Medea myth presents us with two versions of an assemblage, two versions of a putting into arrangement of a series of ideas and responses to the same sets of notation considered within different historical moments, with different dancers, but with specific concepts in mind. One, camp, and the other, the kind of bloodless return of both the first, but also the myth itself. I want to say that these alternative ways of engaging suggest two things. The first is that notation seems to form an interesting part both of the archive but also of what Diana Taylor would call the repertoire, something that dancers are incredibly familiar with as an embodied kind of system of memory, which conveys through the spoken word, movement, dance, and song, and as other performances, as offering an alternative perspective to those derived from the written archive. While in the archive, memory exists as documents, maps, literary texts, letters, or archaeological remains, all those items supposedly resistant to change, as Diana Taylor says. The repertoire, on the other hand, enacts embodied memory. Performances, gestures, oralities, movements, dance, singing, in short, all those thought of as ephemeral, non-reproductive knowledge. Diana Taylor says that the repertoire etymologically means a treasure, an inventory, and also allows for individual agency, referring also to the finder, discoverer, and meaning to find out of repertoire. The second thing that I want to suggest from this is that it presents the gesture as an important part of a system of notation that is live through the repertoire of embodied knowledge. So the gesture itself is a form of notation that can transmit historical and cultural knowledges, and therefore relates to the various forms of notation. These two performances suggest alternative ways of holding and transmitting knowledge and embodied knowledges in relationship to the Medea notation system. One, a camp resurgence of the past, and the future, a half-zombie-like return of the myth, a bloodless reenactment of the former production that looks back as it turns forward, as opposed to the camp's forward-orientated look at making something on the other side of ridicule. Looking at these two possible choreographies from the repertoire, what are the points at which they form encounters with each other? If they're two separate representations and responses to the myth, what makes them similar or unites them? And here I want to think with this idea of gesture as notation and specifically turn to the tragic act of infanticide that Medea performs in each of the productions. So at the culmination of Papaioannou's Medea, and here I'll just give a little bit of brief kind of contextual, chronological play information to situate this act. So at the culmination of Papaioannou'S Medea in 1993 and 2008, the eponymous tragic character stands still in shallow water which floods the performance space, holding two figurines, each a small sculpture about 1.5 feet in length, grey renderings of a child. Medea's arms are out in front of her, biceps perpendicular, forearms parallel to her body. The two children are slot over the end of her forearms. By this point in the performance, Jason has crossed the water in shoes with molded ships for soles. He has taken the ram's horns and bone skirt which encased her flesh and extended her form into a human animal form, part sphinx, swan, gecko, white statue, and Minoan snake goddess. He took these animal adornments from her before they pulled the clothes from each other's bodies and crashed naked against one of the 4 enlarged tables which make up the set. Now Medea stands in the water, gazing out at the audience. She has just seen Jason with another woman, Glauce, and watched the two of them roll naked on the same surface of wood. Medea has slid across the water, gripping 2 enormous chairs, stood precariously on their edges, dragging their weight beneath her, and she has put the ram's horns back on. She has wrapped the bone skirt corset around her chest again and stalked across the water, tearing her body between tense held poses and agitation. And now she stands, holding the children aloft. For a brief moment she is still, looking up and out, until she begins to expand the shape she has initially taken in order to support the statuettes. Her arms move up and out. It is almost a challenge and a call to bear witness, to feel the vibrations of what is about to come. The weight of the statues seems heavier and heavier as her arms extend into this unstable pose. The distension, the effort to keep both statues aloft is visible in her shoulders in both versions and in her biceps. And in both versions, the weight. The stillness before the fall is excruciating. This move provides a moment of suspense, harmonically calling for resolution, which comes terribly as Medea hurls both of her arms down and crashes the statues together. In one version, red feathers, the other white, splatter across the space, scarring either diagonally or horizontally and forward as a sound effect, either a sound effect kind of accompanies this noise to exacerbate it. In both versions, she is not alone, accompanied by Jason, who watches on, as well as Papaioannou's new invention, the figure of the dog, another human animal who introduces us to the world of the plot, and as Papaioannou says, ensures its tragic conclusion. Some of the material crashes into the water, while the feathers, which on impact have made a diagonal scar through space, float down. I want to see one of these versions as a reenactment of the other, and so think about what Andrew Lepecki has termed reenactment's particular economy, where bodies intertwine or intermingle across time. And I want to think about what this means for the complex gestural act Medea performs in these two productions. I think there are many consequences for this kind of thinking, and without supposing the ability to exhaust them all, I want to focus on 3, I think it's like 3.5 maybe. First, we can see how this reiterative gesture is a theatro-historical act of infanticide. Calling attention to the smashing in this way amplifies not the horrific one-off shock of the act of infanticide in Medea, but instead calls attention to the repeatability of the move, its multiplicities, and the always, already, again, and again time of this gesture of killing. Like Jennifer was suggesting yesterday, there is a complex relationship between the body and material. It's not only the act of swinging the arms down, but the crash, the hovering and settling of the destroyed sculpture. It's the choreography of the body and the kind of materials that make up the children that are supposed to render the flesh of the child, that break open in space, that allows us to reconsider also the liveness of gesture, as we cannot simply pin it down to one act in the live present, but instead can see it always as a partly live, partly ghostly, future and inanimate act. Secondly, this reorientates and confuses the temporal drives. As we've seen in discussion of both productions, each of them seems to have either a forward orientation through camp that refers to the past, or a reenactive kind of act that looks backwards as it moves forwards. So this can signal a return both inwards and outwards. The gesture can function as a form of notation and can become a remnant of that which has already happened, an opportunity for it to happen again, happen differently, or not at all. So thirdly, if the past is reiterative and given to these moments of reappearance, then it is always also open to response, creating an antiphonic relationship between and among different times that disrupts a linear model of temporality, allowing us not only to think in the intervals between those times, in their different relations, but also to consider our responsibility to the past. This is a past that in its relational condition is always liable and open to alternative future. Rebecca Schneider, a scholar, dance scholar and theorizer of reenactment, talks about this through a speculative question, which she gets from a kind of conference paper that was put out about the future of reenactment, when she says, "What if the past had another future?" She goes on to write in a recent essay, "The Past May Yet Have Another Future, Gesture in the Times of Hands Up," that perhaps all gestures open these intervals. Perhaps all gestures are interval crosses as well as interval openers. Opening an interval, a greeting, a mode of gesture, establishes both proximity and distance, opening a space for response or crossing an interval with response, or both. And this brings me back to thinking at the close about Isidora's children. Through the opening intervals of gesture, reenacted between the three sets of dancers, there are a series of calls and response, not only back and forth between the performers depicted in the film, but between the dance they collectively perform and Isadora Duncan. She is the absence that ghosts the film. In the same way as Papaioannou describes Medea as generating the feeling that arises from gazing at a statue that indexes the hands of the artist who made it, this return to what Andrew Lepecki calls the tracks and steps and bodies, sweat, performed by past dancers, is, in the case of Isidora's children, a chance to confront and move through some of the grief and pain of the loss of a child. In Medea, there is a diffusion of the affective material of the tragedy between both responses, a connection of pain and the opening and loosening of the act of infanticide, which, like grief itself, threatens to return again and again, carried across the different bodies of the dancers and projected forward into a future time of another iteration of the same myth. Thank you.
Marcus, thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thank you, Sue.
And it's opened up so many questions. And I'm using my privilege as having the mic in my hand.
Please.
to set us off, because immediately your introduction and then coming back to the Isadora thing at the end made me think about the relationship between private and public grief. And I'm wondering, in fact, it also made me think of teaching in memoriam, Tennyson's In Memoriam, in which has always made me think of poetry as a notational gesture in a way, as a gesture to performance, but also to internal expression of internal grief, particularly because that particular epic is a collection of very private lyrics that are put together. And of course there's that, and there's also the queer reading that you can easily do with it, you know, when Tennyson talks about Hallam, you know, his living soul flashed on mine. That to me seems to sum up everything that the Manon film is talking about. So I just wondered if you could say a bit more about that interaction between private and public grief that can be expressed through your theorization, I think, of gesture as notation. Not asking much, Marcus, but...
Thank you so much for that question and for thinking about these two interrelated spaces. Maybe I'll start by saying kind of personally, as an initial response, I watched this film last year still in isolation. And so was thinking a lot about the potentials for expressing grief in a private space, you know, being confined on my own and watching someone come home back to their own space in order to perform this solo. But also how complicated and difficult that kind of relationship is. And that brings to mind for me Joanna Hedver's in Sick Woman Theory, where they write a kind of queer response, a queer and disability-focused response to the protests that were happening for the Black Lives Matter movement, not last year, but the previous time. And they write that the private space, the division between public and private is itself always kind of politically mobile, and that in private you can still form systems of connection and network that can be political, right? So it's to go against that idea that the political is anything that happens in public. Hedver says that political can happen in private, and I think grief can function in that political way, that you can express it privately and still remain connected to others, which I think is kind of what Hedver's pushing forward in that piece. And I think, or I'd like to think, that gesture, or the performances of kind of shared gestures, can be a way of doing that. Yeah.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Yeah. Questions?
Thank you very much, Marcus. I'd really like to see some of this. I have two questions. One is about the choice of music. What was the music used? And the other one is, given the 15 years between these two versions, actually how practically was the second version mounted or recreated? Was there a notated documentation of it, or was it extrapolated from the video of the previous version, or was it Papaioannou working from his own, you know, sort of recreating from his own note? I don't know. I'm just really interested to know that.
No, of course, and thank you for both of those questions. So the music used in both is by Vincenzo Bellini, and it's excerpts from a number of operas: Il Pirata, La Straniera, La Sonnambula, Norma, and Il Puritani. Apologies for pronunciation, people at home and here. But I think what's going on here is a game, like a Maria Callas voice game, in the recordings are of Maria Callas singing the Bellini operas, but I think it's an indirect reference to Maria Callas's performance as Medea in the kind of in her infamous rendering. So I think it's kind of this like displacement of and presence of Maria Callas's voice, but like not directly through the Medea opera itself. And in terms of the kind of practical process of recreating, I've read that he doesn't use notation. He's talked in interviews about kind of using the dances, but I don't know specifically about the case of this revival, and it's a really good question. It's been difficult to, as kind of expressed previously, it's been difficult to access a lot of this information in the lockdown. I've been emailing them, so if they're watching, Hit me up with some information, please. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it was kind of embodied knowledge and kind of sharing, and probably use of video as well.
Because it's very, very interesting if he was changing the casting.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't, the new dancers wouldn't have that embodied knowledge. So I'm just intrigued to know how that, it would be great to know how that was.
He was in the original production, which maybe I should have said. So he used to perform, and still performs in a number of works. So he's in Ink as well. So he played Jason, but also was one of the Argonauts as well in the original. And then in the 2008 staging, he didn't perform. He also has an artistic director who's kind of with him throughout all of the productions. And I've been told that she's very integral to kind of storing the institutional memory of the performances. Again, interesting to think about this kind of gendered labor of archival memory and memorization, which I think often happens in institutional forms of containing or obtaining dance. I know it happened with the kind of Yvonne Rainer memories in MoMA.
Anyone else?
I just have a simple question about the political contexts of these two pieces, because obviously in '93 and 2005 lots of things happened, right? In both in Greece and on the stage of world history, so to speak. So I wonder what the references here are about the bloodless. I was particularly struck by that. And of course the end of the Iron Curtain and all of these things.
Yeah, thank you. That's a brilliant question. And there's, as you say, there's a lot of change. What I'd pull up in the kind of '93 production is particularly the kind of aftermath of the HIV/AIDS virus. Papaioannou makes a work called A Moment's Silence around the same time, which is an explicit threnody to all of those who died from the HIV/AIDS spread of that virus and maltreatment of governments for providing medicine. So that's kind of happening and orbiting in the first iteration, but also kind of, you know, the fall of the wall and the lead up to the kind of the millennium. And then in the second, we're just around the time of the financial crash, which is another thing that both influences massively Athens' political situation in the following years, but also influences Papaioannou's work specifically. So this is one of the last kind of large-scale and big productions that he makes for a while. He does Inside a couple of years later, which is very big and very expensive again, and it's not received well at all in the kind of political climate. It's seen as kind of, I believe, kind of excessive and long and large. But the bloodlessness itself is really interesting, not only because it becomes a feature of contemporary experimental dance performance at the time in the early 2000s. There's a scholar called Hal Foster who writes about the proliferation of dance reenactments at the time and considers them all to have this, he calls it, which is why I cribbed the phrase, the kind of this zombie-like grey temporal quality, particularly of reenactments in America of the kind of happenings of Yvonne Rainer of the 60s and that kind of crowd. Definitely something to kind of keep thinking with, and thank you for your suggestion. I'm sure there are a number of connections to be made. Thank you.
Yes, I wonder if there's any more to be said about the connection with Pina in the political sphere, in relation to the political sphere. When you think of her, you know, her response is not obvious or overt, but resonances of grief for the Holocaust and so on. I wonder if there's something that came out of Tanztheater, because we talked about, you know, Rupert Doonan being on the first day being influenced by Kurt Jooss.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we don't know, do we? But I mean, it looks as if he was. Exactly, yes. So I'm wondering if we could build some kind of textural map here about memory and keeping memories alive, and particular ways in which gestures.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I think that's really brilliant. I actually prepared some extra slides. Sorry. So this is Since She, for an image from Since She on the right, and then Medea on the left. And Since She was the work that kind of like explicitly is a response to Bausch's death, created on the company. Again, a work that deals increasingly with grief and the failure of the ability to kind of process and move on from it. I think what I'd say is that like Bausch's practice was really fundamental in like unlocking, and I thought about this before the talk because maybe I'll sit in the discomfort of the potential contradiction I'm about to introduce. But Bausch is really important about thinking about the body archive of the dancers, the kind of embodied knowledges, as we've seen explored like in the space over the last 2 days, that dancers bring into practice. And Bausch thought that was as important material for choreography, as any other idea. So their personal relationships to each other, their personal memories, their experiences of trauma. And as Papaioannou's career continues, he moves away from this form of narrative as a container for knowledge and ideas and feelings, and instead moves towards the kind of gestures and embodied experiences of the dancers. So it becomes more Bauschian in that sense. And Since She is a really beautiful example of that, where you can, almost spot this kind of like transposed moment of like kind of a Medea tragedy, but it's become, like Tom, you were saying yesterday, like it's become like internalized, like a memory of the gesture being present and played out on stage. And I think that is deeply political, because it allows the kind of the embodied knowledge expression to be as important as stored text. So as Diana Taylor says, again in Archive and Repertoire, what archives normally do is to exclude certain forms of history. You can trace, sorry for name dropping, like you can trace like what Tina Camps calls like the sociality of time, like the differential distribution of death and dying in life. So who's being erased, kind of what genocides are happening to erase forms of knowledge. Embodied knowledge is a political way of allowing that to come back, not only within a community, but across time and space. These aren't particularly radical examples. I mean, Papaioannou favors white dancers, and I think that is loaded for a reason. But it has a political potential to be useful not only in dance, but in different epistemological formations.
Fantastic, thank you.
I mean, just on the topic of Pina Bausch, I know that she was very influential also for Kurdish dancers and Kurdish theater. But I was just wondering whether you had more context on how he chose his dancers, especially with that move of, having those embodied, archives,
right.
And who the dancers were and how he chose them.
So I think it differs by production, and I don't have as specific an answer for this as I'd like to. I've seen interviews with him, I think, where he says, a kind of version of the kind of famous Bausch phrase, which is, it matters more what moves someone than like what moves they're doing, which I feel like he's, referencing to and making part of his practice for choosing dancers in space. But this always seems like a kind of an anathema as a process, right? Because it's a choreographer saying, I'm picking you because I see something internal in you. So I'm sure that's still affected by another parameters. In 1993, I believe it was the AFFORDANCE dance company. So these are kind of the collaborators that he'd worked with already in the kind of squat theater, the DIY theater situation. But in 2008, I'm not sure. And again, a really good question and an area for like, again, thinking about what are the politics of the audition space or the rehearsal room, or whose embodied knowledges are more easily readable by a kind of choreographer like Papaioannou's, and whose might get ignored. So yeah, really great question, thank you.
Any more questions? Thomas has got one. Thomasin up there.
I think Shreya might have a question.
Shreya has a question, thank you.
thank you for that amazing presentation. It's, I'm just wondering if you've thought about the connection between the reenactment of myth and the reenactment of a very simple traditional dance movement again and again, and how the first is sort of repetition of a sort of reimagination, and the second is like the movement is a repetition of sameness, and how memory, how different kinds of memory would help us navigate those two areas.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Shreya. I think to start thinking about a response, and I would love to keep talking about this with you because I won't be able to come up with a kind of extensive one at the moment. But I think the great thing that's introduced or been helpful for me from something like reenactment theory is and from practice, is the almost impossibility of returning again and again to the exact same gesture. It always has like a slightly different kind of tone or feel or quality, or even the fact that it's moving through time. There's these slippages that occur in the reenactment of the same, even if that same is incredibly mundane. And that's something that comes out of postmodern dance practice itself, is the kind of performance of the mundane, like the actions that we treat as mechanical or autonomous. Walking, Rosas dance, Rosas, sitting, Yvonne Rayner lying down, and like how those very acts are both kind of have the kind of social frame, but can never be exactly repeated. Whereas in terms of kind of a reimagining of myth, I wonder if it's about orientation, like towards the reimagining of a myth could be like towards a different like horizon or telling of that myth, whereas the kind of reperformance of a gesture might look back at the one before more. Again, this is very hazy, and I apologize for like being a bit off the cuff, but thank you. Brilliant question.
Any more questions? No, I think we've exhausted our brains for the minute, and it just leaves me to thank you so much, Marcus, for giving us such an amazingly stimulating presentation that actually has brought together again so many of the themes of the conference. And I do believe that we will go on asking these questions this afternoon and beyond. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you, Sue. Thanks, everyone.